Welcome to Oakville Matters. Our city calls itself a town, and we like it to feel like a village. We like to stay in touch with each other. We work together to grow the harmony, safety, and prosperity of our town for everyone. And here's the question that we're answering on this show. What is the outlook for Oakville's affordable renting housing supply and for the people who live in it as they grapple with our growth? And joining us to answer this question are three folks who know the rental housing market from up close and both ends of supply and demand. We have Dr. Brian Doucette from the University of Waterloo, who is the Canada Research Chair in Urban Change and Social Inclusion at the School of Planning. And congratulations, Dr. Doucette. My wife's a professor, and I know that the Canada Research Chair is a big deal in your world. We have Stephanie Clendemic, the Halton Community Legal Clinic's senior staff lawyer, and we have Andrew Balahara, Halton Region's Director of Housing and Social Services. I want to thank you for your service to the public and for joining us today. Let's start at the micro and try to zoom out to the macro. In Oakville, several months ago, a developer applied to demolish a small apartment building with affordable rental units, where there's about 50 or 60 units, to build a new apartment building with around 300. And so on the face of it, we were going to get a big increase in our rental supply. But when you looked into it, the people who live there are concerned that they might not have anywhere to go. And in the as much as 3 years or more that it might take to get this done, the amount of time if they had a right to return, the amount of time they'd have to be away kind of works against the principle of being able to go back. So, Andrew, what alternatives do the people have when this happens to them?
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Mayor, for the question. Certainly, Halton Region offers a number of programs and services for lower to middle income Halton residents, including Oakville residents. We have a Halton Access to Community Housing waitlist, which is a social housing waitlist for individuals with low and middle incomes. So they would have the opportunity to apply to the waitlist. More immediate, we have a program called the Housing Stability Fund. That program provides moving assistance. It provides first and last month's rent to individuals that are displaced that need to find additional housing. And it also pays for moving, storage, and transportation costs. We also make available funding to and support through Halton Housing Help. This is a third-party provider for the region that works with populations to find the more affordable rents in Halton, including in Oakville, and we've had some tremendous successes finding those through that partnership. I think I'd also like to accentuate that regional council has been very opportunistic and very supportive of creating new housing opportunities in our region for a growing population, including folks that have been displaced. So, between 2014 and 2024, there was a target set of creating between 500 to 900 new housing opportunities over that 10-year window. And I'm pleased to inform you with, council support, we exceeded that 2 years early. We've now created 1,021 units and that number continues to grow. And that's creating new assisted housing stock for people of Oakville, people of other municipalities in the region. And in November, of 2021, Regional Council endorsed a 600 additional target through a portfolio approach. And I'm pleased to report that, one of the first projects out of the pipeline is in Oakville, a 52-unit senior supportive housing unit at 263 Kerr Street with a ground floor space. So what this does is this improves the number of available assisted and affordable housing stock for the folks that need it, including folks that may be economically displaced. I would say that all these programs are accessible through 311 anywhere in Halton, or by any means, just call the housing department of the region. We're always willing to assist and help navigate folks into safe, affordable housing.
So in this particular case, which of these avenues would work for the people if they're displaced from an affordable rental unit, but they're not necessarily low income and they're not necessarily in one of your senior brackets? Although they might be.
I think probably the best tool that we can bring to bear is Halton Housing Help. That's available for people of any income bracket, and it will help them to navigate, more other rental listings. One of the services they provide is a robust rental listing of rents in the region. And then we also have other instruments that we can bring to bear, affordable housing benefits, rent supplements, etc. But I know Stephanie will speak a little bit about the legal standpoint, so I'll reserve that for her to speak to. But there are certainly responsibilities of landlords in the case that you referenced, Mayor Burton, and there's obligations that those landlords have to adhere to.
Okay, well, that's a great segue. Stephanie, what obligations do landlords have in Oakville or in Halton?
We'd start with the Residential Tenancies Act, and the obligations, if you're going to renovate a property, would require, first and foremost, that you start with the legal notice of eviction, which is the N13 process. Some people might be familiar with it. The N13 requires that they provide the tenants with 120 days notice. The termination date in the notice has to be the last day of the term. So for tenants who are in a fixed 1-year period, that could potentially buy them longer than 4 months. And then even with that, sorry.
Could you back up and explain that better? Because that sounded like a really interesting wrinkle.
So N13s, when you give it, you have to issue it and provide 120 days notice. So that's 4 months period before the termination date is effective in the notice. But the termination date always has to be the last day of your term. So for most tenants who've been there for many years, they're most likely in a month-to-month rental period, which means the 120 days is most likely going to count as a straight 120 days, depending on the date that it's issued, and the termination date would likely fall at the end of the month, assuming that's their rental period. But for a tenant who is potentially a newer tenant, who has maybe just moved in and is still in a 1-year lease, then even if they were to give the N13, let's say today, the termination date could not be before the end of their term, which would be a lot longer than 120 days in those scenarios.
So that could be complicated for the landlord, I guess.
It could be very complicated, particularly if they have deadlines they need to meet and they need to get vacant possession in order to start the renovations. So that's part of the process. There's also compensation. There's the right of compensation that flows with the N13. If there are 5 or more units, which I believe in the scenario you're describing there would be, then the landlord is legally obligated to provide either 3 months of rent, or essentially, it's going to depend if the situation requires the tenant or the tenant intends on moving back in to the property. If it is a situation where the tenant has given notice that they plan on moving back in after the renovations are complete, then the compensation would be potentially the time that they're away from the property, if that is less than the 3-month period. Maybe
you could do the math on that for me too.
Okay. It typically, for most situations when you're looking at a renovation, it's usually going to be more than 3 months that the tenants are going to be out. So in most scenarios where you are in a dwelling where there is 5 or more units, the tenant is going to receive 3 months compensation. Or if the landlord wishes, they can try and offer a suitable alternative. And if the tenant accepts that, that's always an option as well. Practically speaking, that doesn't happen very often. I think the other big protection that tenants have that a lot of them aren't aware of is the right to return. So when you do receive an N13, the tenant, if they do intend on returning, has to give notice in writing to the landlord that they intend on moving back in. And if they do that, then they have that legal right to come back into the property at the same rent when the renovations are completed. Whether or not that actually happens on the ground is a different question, a different story altogether, but they do in theory have that right. And the N13 is not sort of the end point. So that termination date that is issued in the N13 does not necessarily mean the tenant has to move out by that date. The only way that they can legally be evicted is through an order issued by the landlord and tenant board. So if the landlord wishes to actually go ahead with that, they would have to take the next step and file an application, have a hearing scheduled, at which point the tenant could, ask some questions, challenge it, see whether or not it's being actually issued in good faith, and so on.
Okay. Is there anything else that folks in this situation can look to the legal system for?
It's it's a very tricky situation because when you get the N13, one of the requirements are you look at things like, has the scope of the work been detailed, right, in the N13? Is the scope of the work significant enough to actually require the tenant to be displaced? So that's something that the tenant can look at. If they're talking about redoing a bathroom, that's not the same thing as demolishing the entire unit and having to rebuild it. So there's things like that. We certainly always look at whether or not permits are required. So in an N13, there's typically a little box system where the landlord will check off whether or not they've obtained the necessary permits to do the work, or whether or not they intend on getting the permits required before the hearing date if it's being filed at the landlord and tenant board. There is an option where a landlord can indicate that no permits are necessary to do the work that's required. However, practically speaking, again, when you get to the landlord and tenant board, if you're requiring vacant possession and the tenant to be displaced, generally speaking, the scope of the renovations is going to be significant enough that we'd expect there to be some permits. So sometimes we can find a little bit of some deficiencies in the notices there that can potentially have the application to be dismissed.
So to sum up, you could get 3 months rent towards your accommodation while you wait to go back. But if it's 3 years before you can go back, it's a tight spot.
It's a very tight spot.
Okay.
And to be honest, I mean, sometimes what happens on the ground level is the landlord also doesn't always want to wait and go through that process of having the application be heard at the landlord and tenant board. So they might offer a settlement. So a lot of times what we see at the legal clinic is the landlord will come to the tenants and say, here's sort of a settlement, a dollar figure that we're going to offer you in terms or in exchange of you signing this agreement, agreeing to move out and not sort of filing anything against us, potentially even waiving their right to return to the unit. And those settlements can sometimes be decent, but more often than not, when we start to look at the rent differential of what they're going to be taking on long term, it's not usually such a great deal either. So,
what's the most decent one you've ever seen, in say in terms of months of rent equivalent?
maybe 15,000, 10 or 15,000. But when we look at particularly at a sitting tenant who's been there 20 years, and if their rent is still at 1,200, they're going back out at the market trying to find something at 2,500, 2,600, they'll catch back up to that very, very quickly.
Yeah. So let's turn now to Brian. Brian, given the act that Stephanie walked us through so well, why do Mississauga and Toronto feel like they need a bylaw of their own in this field? And maybe I should ask, and why is Hamilton thinking about doing one? Let's start there. What are the cities trying to achieve?
Well, the way Stephanie describes the situation, it sounds great for tenants, right? It sounds like there are lots of protections in place. There are lots of checks and balances on the use of these N13 notices to evict tenants.
Actually, she didn't leave me feeling that reassured.
Well, that's it. That's just it. The reality for tenants on the ground is it doesn't work like that. The reality is these N13s are used regularly. We're doing a lot of research now with the Social Planning Network of Ontario, looking at displacement across the province in a number of communities. And the stories we hear of, people will get N13 notices sort of left, right, and center. There's all sorts of tactics, direct and indirect harassment tactics that landlords use to try and get tenants out, because as a tenant has been in a property for many years, because they probably enjoy some degree of rent control, there's a huge incentive, a financial incentive for landlords, most of whom, or increasingly, they're not these sort of small mom and pop landlords. These are large financialized companies that make their profit on the basis of evicting sitting tenants, particularly tenants with rent control, and then quote unquote renovating their units. And again, the way it's described sort of on paper, well, yes, you have to be very careful about needing the tenant to be out of the building in order to actually give them an N13. What we see in practice is often very cosmetic maintenance and repairs, things that I could do in my own house without needing to actually vacate. And these are common ways in which people get N13s.
So does Toronto and Mississauga's, do the bylaws in Toronto and Mississauga and the one that Hamilton may adopt improve that situation? And if so, how?
So they do. So one of the big things with the Toronto bylaw that is important is that when there's a notice for demolition, the tenant still has the right to remain in the unit until that demolition takes place. That can often be several years, right? So again, you could imagine that a tenant receives this eviction notice and then they don't have all the time or the knowledge or the resources to fight it, right? They get a notice that they have to leave. So they leave, but they could stay in much longer if they had some degree of protection. And what it guarantees in Toronto and Mississauga is the ability to return to a same unit of similar size and similar bedrooms as was previously in that they were previously living in. City of Toronto estimates that they've protected about 5,000 units of housing with this rental replacement bylaw. But I think actually there are loopholes with this. It's only for 10 years. There are still, ways around it. But the gold standard in Canada is actually in Burnaby, British Columbia, where they have a rental replacement rules that actually put the onus on the landlord. So part of the problem with all these rules is that largely the onus is on the tenant to find that temporary accommodation, to pay for those moving costs. And then, yes, they have the ability to return. But you can imagine if you've had to move once, are you going to move again? And you've disrupted your lives, your kids have moved schools. So in Burnaby, they have a number of initiatives that place the onus of responsibility on the rezoning applicant to actually provide interim housing for tenants to replace those units. And they actually have a 20% affordable housing requirement in new rental units. So if 10% of those units are rental replacement, they still need to provide another 10% affordable housing. And importantly, the moving costs fall under the responsibility of the landlord or the rezoning applicant, i.e. the developer, and not the tenant. And that's had a huge impact over in Burnaby.
Yeah, so that sounds like a very exciting package if you are a tenant facing this. Why would Toronto and Mississauga not go that far? Is there something holding us back in Ontario?
I mean, you'd have to speak to the folks over there. I mean, the Burnaby rules, from what I understand, are really among the strongest in the country. And we often, we look at who votes, and it tends to be homeowners, not tenants, who vote more. So you look at the concerns, you look at the issues that are brought to councils, brought to policymakers, planners, and so on. And we tend not to focus as much on tenant issues as we do on homeowner issues.
All right. And in Hamilton, I heard that the council was told by one of the delegations or one of the people that spoke to them that they couldn't do this. Can you help us understand that part?
Yeah, so Hamilton's rules are not necessarily about rental replacement, which would involve the demolition of a building and its replacement, right? So you demolish the example you gave at the outset. Hamilton's rules really apply to the renovation aspect, to renovictions, which again, there's a lot of overlap and a lot of similarity, but it's basically keeping the same building, evicting all the tenants within that building, and then renovating, quote unquote, renovating the units, and then renting them out at higher rents, generally to more affluent tenants. And Hamilton is really seriously looking into this, and there are different opinions. You ask 5 lawyers about an issue, you get 6 different opinions. I know I've been doing some work with Acorn Hamilton, and they've got their own legal advice that says introducing an anti-renoviction bylaw similar to what New Westminster in British Columbia had and introduced in 2019, which, by the way, basically eliminated renovictions in New Westminster. They went from about 333 the year before the bylaw was introduced to 0 when it was introduced, because it shifted the onus of responsibility to the landlord, to the property owner. And it fined landlords very heavily and threatened to take away their landlord licenses if they actually evicted people in bad faith in this way. And so it managed to basically solve that problem. So people in Hamilton are really looking at whether or not this can be implemented. From what I've read, I'm a planning scholar, not a legal scholar, but from what I've read of these different perspectives, that it is within Hamilton's remit. It is a big crisis. It's a big issue. Cities do have powers to act in many ways. And when New Westminster introduced its bylaw a number of years ago, no one was really sure if it could stand up to legal challenges in that city. It stood up to 2 legal challenges and was eventually superseded by a BC-wide anti-renoviction bylaw. So Hamilton is kind of at the forefront of this here in Ontario, and given the lack of strength in some of the provincial regulations that have been introduced, cities have to be proactive and have to take the initiative themselves.
Okay. Well, I'll take that as a challenge. I'm pretty confident that my council will support a bylaw like this when we bring it forward. And I hope we'll get a rave review from all three of you when we do it. Generally, do we think there's a role for Canada, for the Canadian government in this area? Is there something we could be demanding from Ottawa, or perhaps begging from Ottawa? Anybody? Nobody.
I would say, Mr. Mayor, stronger regulations perhaps, and dedicated investment to create new assisted affordable units for folks that need them. Regulatory reform, I think, would be good.
So translation, more money, please.
More money, please. Absolutely, Mr. Mayor. Yeah.
I know we do that. Brian?
I actually don't think it's a case of more money, because the federal government is investing billions in the housing, in housing at the moment. It's just not necessarily going to the right places. So again, it comes back to, we always talk about supply, but we never ask the question of supply for whom. And the National Housing Strategy is investing billions in new construction. The problem is it's not going to the communities, not necessarily geographically, but the populations that need it most. So there was some estimates that would say of all this money in this housing National Housing Strategy, about 3 or 4% is actually going to new housing units that are affordable to people in core housing need. So there's a lot of money being invested.
There's a lot of money in 4 strands. One you mentioned, the other is for social infrastructure, the other is for physical infrastructure, and then there's a bag for general market. So as a longtime mayor, I have to say that Ottawa announces money all the time, but it seldom flows. And here in Halton, my abiding conviction is we never get our fair share because it just doesn't show up here. Andrew referred to a portfolio approach where we weren't getting any projects approved, and they said, well, you should batch them together and call it a portfolio and we'll get you some. So we did that, and the normal deal is 1/3, 1/3, 1/3, and the feds couldn't come up with their third. They did come up with something, so we were no longer dry, but we didn't get anything like what was supposed to be done. And Stephanie, in terms of the Act and the Mississauga and Toronto bylaws, in case you're familiar with them, do you have any advice for us if we, when we are so bold as to roll out an Oakville bylaw? I'm convinced that Mississauga and Toronto should not be the only municipalities with a affordable rent protection bylaw, and I'm wired to always want to be best. So I'm looking for ideas for how can ours be better than theirs? And I'm wondering if you have suggestions.
Yeah, I don't have any particular thoughts on any specific bylaws, but I definitely agree that that modifying some of these or creating new bylaws is definitely a step in the right direction. I think that what Dr. Doucette was explaining, what they've done in Westminster and BC and stuff, is just really phenomenal, and we've seen the effects and sort of how it's really curtailed renovictions out there. But I think at the end of the day, we need to also think a little bit more of an upstream approach and address sort of the root causes to the issue rather than just constantly treating some of the symptoms. And I don't know, I think about ways to curb vacancy decontrol, for example, because the way that the system currently operates is we actually have a built-in strong incentive for landlords to engage in practices like renovictions or evictions based on landlord's own use, purchaser's own use, all these sort of similar types of no-fault types of evictions. There's a strong incentive built into the system for them to engage in that type of practice. And, practically speaking, we're losing affordable housing stock faster than we can even create it.
Yeah.
And we have 2 types of vacancy decontrol. We have obviously the reset in between tenancies, and then we have the 2018 exemption. So those are some things to start with that I can think of on the top of my head.
Yeah, in Brian's article, he laid out some shocking statistics about loss of affordable housing in the last few years. Brian?
Yeah, in cities like Hamilton, there's some estimates that for every new unit of affordable housing that's added to the supply, the city is losing 20, 25, I think the number is as high as 29 existing units. And this is happening through renovictions, right? So these units are renovated, the tenants paying generally below market rent are evicted, and also through demolition as well. And so it's far cheaper to keep the housing that we have affordable than it is to build new affordable housing. And Stephanie is exactly right. We have very weak rent control rules in Ontario that create huge incentives for landlords to evict sitting tenants. And if we had stronger rent control rules, there's no evidence, no real world evidence that suggests that that doesn't lead to a massive drop in new construction, as some people might claim. What it does do is actually provide tenants with protections, provides tenants with affordable rent. And if that rent control is tied to the unit rather than the tenant, it means the next tenant coming in also enjoys that same rent control. And there's very few places in the country that do that. Prince Edward Island does it, and rents are much lower on average, or have been rising much slower. Manitoba has some degree of that kind of rent control. And again, in the last few years, rents have risen slower than in the rest of the country. So there's a need at the provincial level to really rethink rent control.
Yeah, I was struck in your article by, you cited a study that said in one 5-year period, Canada, that 322,000 affordable homes were lost across Canada between 2011 and 16, compared to the construction of only 60,000 new homes for those in greatest need of housing. That was a very sobering statistic. Thank you very much to all three of you for this. And I want to say that you've inspired me to go a little outside Ontario and import those bylaws and laws that you've mentioned in British Columbia, in Burnaby and Westminster and BC, to see what we might be able to do. And I want to thank you for joining us today. And you can reach me at mayor@oakville.ca if you'd like to encourage or discourage this avenue of work, or if you want to suggest a topic for another show. Thanks for being with us. We'll see you next time.